There is a kind of devotion that feels immovable because it is ancient, structured, and reinforced by generations of agreement. It carries the weight of continuity, the authority of teachers, and the comfort of familiarity. Yet within that same structure there exists a quiet danger, the possibility that what was meant to preserve the will of God can slowly begin to replace it. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7 verses 1 through 13, we are drawn into a moment where that danger is not only exposed, but dismantled with precision. This is not a casual disagreement. It is a collision between divine intent and human construction, between the commandment of God and the accumulated authority of tradition. And at the center of that collision stands a single word spoken with devastating clarity: Corban. The scene unfolds in an atmosphere thick with expectation and scrutiny. The Pharisees and scribes, figures deeply embedded in the religious fabric of their time, approach Jesus not as neutral observers but as guardians of a system they believe reflects God's will. Their concern appears, at first glance, almost mundane. They notice that his disciples eat bread with hands that have not been ritually washed. In their language, these are defiled hands, not in the sense of physical dirt, but in the sense of ritual impurity. This practice of washing, known in later tradition and discussed within frameworks like the Mishnah and expanded in the Talmud, represents more than hygiene. It is a visible marker of belonging, discipline, and obedience to what they call the tradition of the elders. So they ask him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" The question is carefully framed. It is not an accusation of breaking the law of God directly, but of deviating from the interpretive tradition that has come to surround and define that law. In that distinction lies the entire tension of the passage. Because what is being defended is not the written commandment itself, but the structure built around it. Jesus does not respond by debating the mechanics of washing. He does not engage in technical argument. Instead, he reaches beneath the surface and exposes the foundation. Quoting the prophet Isaiah, he says, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.'" The word hypocrites here is not a casual insult. It evokes the image of an actor, someone performing a role. What Jesus is revealing is not merely incorrect practice, but a performance of devotion that has become detached from its source. Their lips speak honor, their rituals display reverence, yet their inner alignment, their heart, the center of will and intention, is distant. He continues, sharpening the critique, "You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men." The force of this statement lies in its directness. There is no attempt to soften the contrast. It is not that they have added tradition to the commandment, it is that in holding tightly to tradition, they have loosened their grip on the commandment itself. What was meant to serve the law has begun to supplant it. Then, with deliberate precision, Jesus introduces an example that brings the abstract accusation into concrete reality. You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. There is almost an edge of irony in his words. A fine way. A system that appears refined, structured, even admirable, yet functions in opposition to what it claims to uphold. And then he anchors the discussion in one of the most fundamental commandments. For Moses said, "Honor your father and your mother," and "Whoever reviles father or mother must surely die." The command to honor parents is not peripheral in the Torah. It stands at the intersection of covenant and community, shaping how relationships are ordered within the people of God. In Hebrew, the verb, kaved, carries the sense of weight, of giving substance and significance. To honor is not merely to respect in words, but to act in ways that uphold the dignity and needs of one's parents. It is a command that bridges the spiritual and the practical, the sacred and the everyday. But then Jesus presents the contradiction. "But you say, if a man tells his father or his mother, 'Whatever you would have gained from me is Corban,' that is, given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother." The word Corban, rooted in the Hebrew, Corban, originally signifies an offering brought near to God. It is an act of devotion, something consecrated, set apart, no longer part of ordinary use. In the temple context, it is sacred. It represents giving to God what belongs to Him. Yet within the interpretive system being addressed, this sacred concept becomes a mechanism. A person can declare his resources as Corban, dedicated to God, and by doing so, he places them beyond the reach of other obligations. What is striking is not merely that this declaration exists, but that it is treated as binding. It functions as a vow, a neder, a spoken commitment that carries legal and moral weight. In discussions preserved within the Talmud, vows are treated with great seriousness. Words create boundaries, establish prohibitions, and define what can and cannot be done. To break a vow is to violate one's word before God. But here, that very seriousness becomes the problem, because the vow of Corban, instead of deepening obedience, becomes a way to redirect it. A son, whose parents are in need, can declare his resources as dedicated to God and thereby exempt himself from the responsibility to support them. And the system, rather than challenging this contradiction, upholds it. It recognizes the vow as valid and, in doing so, effectively releases the individual from the commandment to honor his parents. Jesus does not allow this to remain hidden behind legal language. He states the consequence plainly, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. The phrase, making void, carries the sense of nullifying, rendering ineffective. The commandment still exists in theory, but in practice it has been neutralized. It has lost its force, not because it was denied, but because it was reinterpreted into irrelevance. And then he adds a final, sweeping statement, and many such things you do. This is not an isolated case. It is a pattern, a recurring dynamic in which the structures meant to preserve obedience become the very means by which obedience is redefined. Corban is not the exception, it is the example. To understand the depth of this moment, one must step into the mindset of those being addressed. The Pharisees and scribes are not villains in their own eyes. They are devoted, disciplined, and committed to preserving the holiness of the law. The traditions they uphold are not arbitrary inventions but the result of generations of reflection, debate, and application. Within texts like the Mishnah and later the Talmud, we see a sincere effort to wrestle with the complexities of living out divine commandments in a changing world. The oral Torah functions as a living conversation, an attempt to bridge the gap between text and life. Yet this very strength contains a vulnerability, because when interpretation accumulates authority, it can begin to operate independently of the original command. It can create a framework in which obedience is measured not by alignment with divine intent, but by adherence to the system itself. In such a framework, it becomes possible to fulfill the requirements of the system while contradicting the heart of the commandment. This is the tension that Jesus exposes. It is not a rejection of tradition as such, but a rejection of tradition when it displaces the commandment it was meant to serve. The linguistic dimension of the passage deepens this tension. The Hebrew concept of Corban carries the idea of drawing near to God, of creating proximity through offering. The tragedy in Mark 7 is that what is meant to bring someone closer to God becomes the very thing that distances them from His will. Similarly, the command to honor parents, rooted in Kabed, calls for giving weight and substance to relational responsibility. When Corban is used to avoid that responsibility, the language of devotion is turned against the practice of obedience. On the Greek side, the terms used in the Gospel sharpen the critique. Words like hypocrites, vain, and make void carry connotations that reveal the severity of the situation. This is not a minor adjustment or a secondary issue. It is a fundamental misalignment between what is said and what is lived, between what is taught and what is intended. At a theological level, the passage confronts the question of authority with unflinching clarity. Who defines obedience? Is it the commandment as given, or the interpretive tradition that surrounds it? And what happens when the two come into conflict? Jesus' answer is unmistakable. The commandment of God cannot be subordinated to human tradition, no matter how ancient or sophisticated that tradition may be. When such subordination occurs, the result is not enhanced obedience but its distortion. There is also a profound ethical dimension to this confrontation. By focusing on the command to honor parents, Jesus highlights the relational core of the law. The commandments are not abstract rules. They are expressions of how life within the covenant is meant to function. They shape relationships, define responsibilities, and reflect the character of God in the life of the community. When a system allows those responsibilities to be bypassed in the name of devotion, it reveals a disconnect between the form of religion and its substance. The spiritual dimension is perhaps the most unsettling. The critique of honoring God with lips while the heart is distant speaks to a condition in which external conformity masks internal disconnection. This is not overt rebellion, it is subtle misalignment. It is the ability to perform the actions of devotion without engaging the intention that gives those actions meaning. In such a state, religion continues, rituals are observed, language remains pious, yet the underlying orientation toward God's will is compromised. The final statement, "and many such things you do," lingers as an open-ended warning. It suggests that the dynamic revealed in the example of Corban is not confined to a particular time or place. It is a recurring possibility within any religious system. Wherever traditions accumulate, wherever interpretations gain authority, wherever structures are built to preserve what is sacred, there exists the potential for those structures to become ends in themselves. And when they do, they can begin to redefine obedience in ways that are difficult to detect precisely because they are embedded within the language and practice of devotion. This is what makes the passage so enduring. It does not merely address a historical controversy, it exposes a pattern that transcends context. It challenges any system that assumes its own alignment with divine will without continual examination. It calls for a return to the commandment, not as an abstract ideal, but as a living expression of God's intent. And it insists that true devotion cannot be measured solely by external conformity, but must be grounded in a heart that is aligned with what God has actually commanded. In the end, Corban stands as both symbol and warning. It represents the capacity of religious language to be used in ways that contradict its original purpose. It reveals how easily the forms of devotion can be preserved while their substance is altered. And it underscores the necessity of discerning not only what is practiced, but why it is practiced, and whether it truly reflects the will of the one to whom it is offered.